The shot cracked through the still mountain air just as a young recruit's finger began to squeeze his trigger. Everything froze. 1 second earlier and someone would have died. 1 second later and that same fate would have followed. Across the sniper range, officials from the Pentagon camera crews, instructors and trainees turned in stunned silence, scanning for the source. Smoke still drifted low along the ground, part of a carefully staged simulation, now shattered by something no one had planned. Near the far corner of the maintenance bay, a figure stepped forward, slowly cradling a long rifle with dark wood and worn metal. She didn't wear tactical gear or a polished uniform. Her boots were old, scuffed from years of use. Her coat hung loose and plain, and her posture lacked the swagger common to most soldiers on that base. The rifle in her hands was clearly from another era, the kind of weapon most of the recruits mocked when they passed it in the armory. But it had just saved a life. A range officer barked into a radio. Who fired that? No answer came. Not yet. Because the woman who fired the shot wasn't running or ducking or explaining. She simply walked forward through the dust, unhurried calm. The shot she'd made wasn't luck. It wasn't panic. It was something else entirely. A kind of knowing. She stopped near the observation line where the general stood and glanced toward a stunned young man still holding his weapon, his hands trembling. Beyond the targets, a technician had just dropped his toolbox and backed away in disbelief, realizing he'd been one breath from tragedy. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was clear but steady, like someone who'd waited a long time to be heard. There was a malfunction, and a civilian in the line of fire. I had to take the shot. No one argued. No one moved. The moment held its breath, and in that silence, every person on that range had the same unspoken question. Who was she? And why did the janitor carry a rifle that could do what no one else dared try? Rachel Cooper never made much noise when she entered a room. She wasn't the type to speak unless something needed saying. At 35, she wore her years in quiet ways, in the lines at the corner of her eyes, the steady way she walked, and the small, careful way she smiled. She came from a little town in Montana, the kind where folks knew each other by the sound of their boots on the porch. Her grandfather, a Vietnam vet, had raised her after her mother passed when she was 9. He taught her how to shoot before she could reach the trigger without a stool. But he also taught her how to breathe slow, how to listen to wind through trees, how to trust silence more than words. By 16, Rachel could hit a tin can at 500 yards with a bolt-action rifle nearly as old as her grandfather. She kept a small leather notebook even back then, logging wind speeds, distances, terrain angles. Most kids carried phones. She carried data. Through the years, that notebook thickened with scribbled charts and hand-drawn diagrams. It wasn't for school. It was for understanding. After high school, Rachel enlisted in the Army. She didn't go into combat. She worked in supply logistics, the backbone of things no one really noticed unless it broke. While others chased medals, she chased precision. She kept shooting, mostly alone, mostly quiet. On weekends, she went to ranges outside base limits, borrowed old rifles, tested variables, and logged more notes. People often forgot her name, but they never forgot her work. Everything she handled was clean, on time, exact. After 10 years and countless shifts behind supply lines, she applied for sniper qualification. Her supervisors were surprised. Her peers rolled their eyes. She was older than the rest, slower maybe, but her scores told another story. She aced the marksmanship exam. Not just passed, topped it. Even the instructors couldn't ignore it. Her name found its way into a small file that landed on someone's desk at Fort Bright Rock, the elite sniper school buried in the Rockies. She received her acceptance by email alone, in a supply depot, with grease on her sleeves and a broken radio in her lap. She didn't cry. She just stared at the screen for a long moment, closed the laptop, and got back to work. When she arrived at Bright Rock, her boots were worn and her jacket faded. Her rifle came wrapped in canvas, the same bolt-action model her grandfather once used. Other recruits brought sleek black rifles with advanced scopes and carbon fiber frames. Rachel brought memory and math. They brought bravado. She brought the weight of 15 years of silent discipline. She didn't correct anyone who mistook her for support staff. She just listened, watched, wrote in her notebook. At night in the barracks, while others compared specs and bragged about range times, Rachel sat by her bunk with a small pencil and a flashlight sketching flag movements and distance markers. She didn't need attention. She needed alignment. And deep down, she believed something most of them had forgotten. That shooting wasn't about noise or speed or swagger. It was about knowing the one shot that mattered and being ready for it when no one else was. That's why she came. Not to prove them wrong, just to prove herself right. The wind hit hard as Rachel stepped off the transport truck at Fort Bright Rock, sharp and uninviting. The facility didn't feel like a base. It felt like a fortress carved into the cold face of the mountain, all concrete and clipped orders. She held her duffel in one hand and the long rifle case in the other, the canvas worn smooth along the corners. Around her, the other recruits stood taller, younger, louder. Their gear was fresh boots, polished rifles gleaming with sleek polymer parts and customized scopes. Rachel's rifle case looked like something forgotten in an attic. One of the trainees pointed and laughed, and others followed his glance. The sound carried in the still air. Tyler Stone didn't wait long to make his voice heard. He was broad-shouldered, 22 at most, and already talking like he owned the place. When he saw her rifle, he smirked and nudged the guy next to him. Mail clerk brought Grandpa's hunting gear. Somebody tell her, sniper school's not a Civil War reenactment. The others laughed without restraint. Rachel didn't respond. She'd heard worse. Instead, she looked up at the range flags, reading the direction of the gusts without blinking. The air smelled of pine and gun oil. She opened her notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and started a wind chart with quick, practiced strokes. Captain Trent Davis walked the line of recruits, calling names and checking assignments. He didn't even glance at her until he hit the bottom of the roster. His brow twitched. Cooper. Logistics transfer. What's your function? She met his eyes. Sniper candidate. He let out a short breath, half disapproval, half disbelief. She stood straighter but kept her tone calm. He glanced at her boots, then her case, then moved on. The dismissal stung more than any joke. Rachel returned to her chart, marking gust intervals like she didn't notice the snickers behind her. Inside the barracks, the walls were lined with steel beds and lockers. Everything uniform, everything sharp. Rachel's gear looked out of place the second she laid it down. Tyler's voice floated across the room. Bet she lasts 3 days. Loses a magazine, gets sent back to fix copy machines. Someone muttered something about old ladies and sewing kits. Rachel ignored it all. She unpacked her rifle, checking the bolts and barrel like she always did. Each piece had a history, each scratch a lesson. She ran a cloth down the length of the barrel and checked her notes again, while they polished their scopes and laughed about kill counts. From video games, she adjusted for humidity and altitude. She didn't need their approval. She needed the shot, and deep down she knew they wouldn't see her coming. Not until it was too late. The range stretched out under a pale sky, quiet except for the mountain wind brushing through the flags. 12 lanes, steel targets from 200 to 800 yards, all timed. Rachel lay prone on her matte bolt action rifle, in place notebook folded beside her. Captain Davis stood on the platform, voice flat through the loudspeaker. Shooters. 60 seconds per target. Speed and accuracy. Both or neither. A sharp whistle cut the silence. The others fired fast semi-automatics, barking in rhythm. Tyler was already 2 targets ahead by the time Rachel sent her first round. She adjusted between shots, factoring for wind drift and slope. Her breathing matched the beat of her pulse. She took her time, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. With every squeeze, her bullet hit dead center. No drift, no error. But the clock didn't care about precision. At 40 seconds, she was still on her 5th target. Tyler was on his 8th. His groupings wide and sloppy, but he was fast. Rachel chambered her next round with smooth, familiar motion. She knew the sound, the feel, the resistance. But the seconds vanished quicker than bullets. When the final whistle blew, she had 2 targets left untouched. Silence settled over the field. Instructors moved from lane to lane, marking scores. Sergeant Briggs stopped at her mat, brow furrowed. He didn't say much, just nodded slowly. Clean shots, tightest grouping of the day, but incomplete. She nodded once, understanding the rule before he spoke it. Rules were rules. Back at the barracks, Tyler leaned against the doorframe with a smirk. Should have brought a faster gun, Grandma. Maybe they'll let you stamp envelopes now. The others laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was easy. She walked past them without a word and found a folded paper waiting on her bunk. Reassignment, armory support, effective immediately. No debrief, no feedback, just a dry line on official letterhead that wiped out years of quiet work. She sat down slowly, the weight of it pressing deeper than she expected. 15 years of preparation erased in 3 seconds of missed time. She opened her notebook, added a final note under the day's chart. Wind conditions steady, impact on system negligible, impact on outcome total. She closed the cover gently, like saying goodbye to something that had never gotten its turn. Her dream hadn't shattered. It had just been quietly pushed aside. The armory smelled of solvent and steel, a place where things were fixed, but no one lingered. Rachel showed up early each morning, her name quietly penciled onto the duty roster under support. She wore gloves most of the time, not to keep her hands clean, but to avoid fingerprints on other people's mistakes. Recruits came in and dropped their rifles like delivery boxes, barely looking her way. They called her ghost janitor, logistics zombie. Tyler made it a habit to remind everyone she had washed out, but Rachel said nothing, just nodded and took their weapons into her workspace. She inspected every rifle like it had a secret to tell. She could feel worn screws, misaligned scopes, subtle slack in trigger pull. Some rifles showed signs of rough handling, rushed cleaning overcompensation with aftermarket parts. She started writing it all down, first in margins, then in full pages. One day she noticed Tyler's rifle had a trigger reset lagging under pressure. It pulled left when fired too fast. Another had an optic shift that worsened with elevation changes. These weren't one-time defects. They were patterns, and most of them came from the same shooters who topped the speed charts. Rachel started charting these issues beside names, not official records, just notes, consistent timing errors, recoil mismanagement, jamming risks under simulated stress. She didn't confront anyone. No one would have listened. Instead, she cleaned and calibrated returning weapons better than she received them. They never noticed the fixes. Tyler kept bragging about his raw talent, never knowing she'd adjusted his scope to stop his misses from drifting past the scoring rings. The more she saw, the clearer it became. The school had taught them to move fast, but not to shoot well. She logged all of it. Names, weapon types, serials, time-stamped flaws. It gave her something the program had taken away: control. And as the pages of her notebook grew thick again, she began to wonder what else the system wasn't seeing. Some days Master Sergeant Haynes would glance over and raise a brow. "You write more than you talk, Cooper." She'd give a half smile and keep writing. He didn't press. Maybe he saw something in her that others missed, or maybe he knew what it meant to stay quiet and sharp at the same time. Outside, the recruits practiced with louder and louder confidence. Inside, Rachel built a silent record of everything they tried to outrun. She saw what they couldn't, that their speed was a mask, and underneath it the cracks were spreading. One afternoon, while logging serial numbers for maintenance, Rachel noticed a terminal in the corner of the armory marked for range diagnostics. It wasn't locked, just sitting there with an admin screen open waiting. She hesitated only a second before pulling up the records. The data was deeper than anything she'd seen. Shot timing, recoil profiles, missed engagements under simulated stress. Each recruit had a digital shadow, a full performance history broken down into cold numbers. She scanned Tyler's record first, then others. It was all there. High-speed shooters performed well in basic drills but fell apart under stress. Their grouping widened. Miss rates doubled. Some even skipped targets in panic. Rachel felt her jaw tighten. This wasn't just about mistakes. It was a flaw in the system, a pattern the instructors had missed or worse ignored. She sat back and stared at the screen. This wasn't her job. She wasn't supposed to access classified logs. But the truth was undeniable. The program was producing graduates who looked sharp on paper, but could break in real combat. She opened her notebook and started writing. For days, she stayed late, cross-referencing maintenance issues with range reports, rifles that jammed matched shooters with shaky stress results. She tracked wind speed optic failures, firing position breakdowns. The more she connected, the more dangerous the picture became. The school was passing candidates who couldn't handle real-world uncertainty. Still, she said nothing. Instead, she compiled a report in secret. It had no title at first, just graphs, observations, and names blacked out with care. She didn't want revenge. She wanted change. But change always came with risk. Late one night, she considered deleting it all. If she sent it up the chain, they might accuse her of stepping out of line. She'd already been labeled a failure. No one would want to hear from the woman polishing rifles in the back room, but the thought of staying silent sat worse in her chest. She renamed the file. Precision versus Speed. A readiness review. Then saved it to a thumb drive wrapped in a piece of cloth from her old uniform. She tucked it deep into her locker beneath spare rags and unused scope covers. The next morning she found someone had been through the terminal logs. The screen had a new password prompt. Nothing was said, but she knew someone had noticed. As she cleaned a rifle that afternoon, Master Sergeant Haynes watched her more closely than usual. He didn't ask questions, just nodded once and walked away. Rachel understood. The storm hadn't started yet, but the wind had changed. The convoy rolled through the front gates of Fort Bright Rock just after dawn. Black SUVs, flag emblems, polished boots. General Morrison stepped out first, flanked by aides and Pentagon brass, all here to witness the future of sniper warfare in motion. The base had been scrubbed clean. Flags were crisp uniforms, sharper than usual, voices clipped and rehearsed. This wasn't training. It was performance. Rachel watched it all from the edge of the armory window, her hands still smudged with carbon from a stripped bolt. She wasn't invited, but she never expected to be. The recruits were lined up for the showcase. Tyler stood front and center, his rifle gleaming like a museum piece. Cameras clicked. Officials nodded. Captain Davis briefed the general with just enough distance in his voice to sound official, just enough pride to sell it. Rachel scanned the range. Everything looked in place at first. Targets stood tall at set intervals. Wind flags waved in gentle rhythm. But then she saw it. One of the remote-controlled targets jittered sideways instead of popping vertically. A tech near the back crouched to fix something just inside the live fire perimeter. Rachel narrowed her eyes. No alert had gone out. The comms line was still open with static, part of the simulation's ambient noise. She saw the worker pause, then step further in to inspect a mechanism. No one else seemed to notice. Everyone's focus was on the firing line. Smoke canisters fired off in waves, the range filled with artificial haze timed to increase pressure. Rachel reached for her spotting scope and dialed it tight. From her window, she tracked the field with growing concern. The tech was now directly behind the 600-yard mark. On the line, Tyler steadied his rifle, his posture confident, his angle perfect for the wrong target. The malfunction had triggered a sequence error. The target at 300 yards had failed to drop, while the one behind it had popped early, nearly in the path of the technician. Rachel moved faster now. She turned to the comms radio but found only garbled noise. She tried the emergency override. Still nothing. Part of the simulation, they'd said. Realism, they called it. But no one had planned for a civilian in the line of fire. Tyler shifted position. She knew that stance. He was locking in. The shot would come in less than 5 seconds. She glanced back through the scope, heart thudding low and steady. The tech was still moving just enough for a fatal mistake if the bullet veered. Rachel looked at the flags. Left to right drift. Moderate crosswind. The kind of detail that Tyler never compensated for under stress. Her hands moved before her thoughts did. She grabbed her rifle from the corner, the same one they'd laughed at, the one she knew like her own breath. She had no orders, no time, just one shot, and no one else could see what was about to happen. Rachel dropped to one knee at the open window, steadying the rifle against the frame. She breathed in once, just enough to settle her focus. The world outside blurred at the edges until only the scope view remained clear. Tyler's finger hovered on his trigger eye, locked onto what he thought was the correct target. The tech moved again behind the range, crouched low, unaware. Rachel's sight shifted not to the target, not to Tyler's body, but to the slim receiver of his rifle just behind the chamber. Wind flags pushed softly right. 3 mph crosswind. She adjusted 3 clicks. Distance 350 yards. Slight angle down. She didn't think. Her body knew. Her mind held still. The moment stretched thin like thread. She squeezed the trigger. A sharp crack echoed across the range, splitting the false silence in two. Tyler's weapon jerked sideways in his hands. His shot never came. He stumbled backwards, stunned the rifle falling to the ground with a sharp clatter. All eyes turned toward the source. Rachel stood slowly, setting the rifle down with care. Her face gave away nothing. She walked out of the armory with the same calm she always carried, boots crunching steady over gravel. General Morrison turned, brows knit. Captain Davis's voice rose through the static, demanding answers. Rachel kept walking. At the firing line, Tyler still stared at his weapon, smoke curling from the receiver. The casing was split clean, disabled but intact. No explosion, no harm, just silence. She reached the line and looked straight ahead. The tech worker in the distance had stopped moving hand to chest, realizing what could have happened. Rachel's voice came steady and low. There was a system malfunction. A civilian stepped into the zone. The target misfired. I had a shot, and I took it. No one spoke. General Morrison studied her closely, then turned to look downrange where the true scope of the near disaster took shape. Rachel stood still, hands at her sides, her shadow long in the dusty light. Her old rifle rested quietly at the window, warm to the touch. Behind her, the wind carried the faintest sound of applause, or maybe just the flags whispering something new. The room smelled like dust and authority. Long table metal chairs, projection screen humming low. Rachel sat at one end with her notebook closed in front of her, fingers resting gently on the cover. General Morrison leaned forward, flanked by officers in clean uniforms and sharp stares. Captain Davis sat farther down, arms crossed, jaw locked. The general's voice cut through the quiet. "Walk us through the shot." Rachel nodded, steady but not stiff. She described what she saw. The system glitch. The technician stepping too far into the field. The wind speed. The malfunctioned target sequence. The silence in the room deepened as she spoke. Not dramatic, just clear. They hadn't expected her to be so composed. She flipped open her notebook and slid it forward. Charts, bullet patterns, stress reaction notes, rifle malfunctions cross-referenced with firing performance. A few brows furrowed. A colonel whispered something to the officer next to him. Rachel continued, explaining how she had tracked patterns for weeks, how fast shooters missed under pressure, and how no one had noticed, because no one had looked. Someone scoffed low. She glanced toward the sound but didn't flinch. Another officer questioned her authority, reminded her she wasn't even a graduate. Rachel met his eyes. "I don't outrank anyone here, but I've fixed every weapon in that room. I've seen what they can do, clean, cold, and timed, and what they can't do when it counts." The general leaned back. "And you believe the training model is flawed?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "I know it is. You're measuring speed like it's the whole game. But out there, when it's real fast isn't enough. Fast without accuracy gets people killed." There was no applause, no immediate shift, just a long pause that hung between doubt and something else. Then someone asked for a copy of her analysis. Another leaned in to examine a chart. Captain Davis didn't speak, but his eyes narrowed. The room had changed. Not completely, not loudly, but enough. Rachel stayed quiet as the questions came, not defensive, just certain. Her voice didn't rise. Her hands didn't shake. For the first time since she'd arrived at Bright Rock, no one looked past her. No one laughed. She wasn't a ghost in the corner anymore. She was the one who saw what no one else dared. General Morrison stood at the head of the room, the thick report spread out in front of her. Her eyes moved slowly across the data over charts and notes that had once lived only in Rachel's hands. The silence felt heavier now, not from doubt, but from something close to respect. She looked up, voice firm. "This program is changing. Effective immediately, we restructure training to measure not just speed, but readiness under pressure." The instructor sat straighter. Captain Davis shifted in his seat but said nothing. The decision was no longer his to make. Rachel didn't speak. Her hands were still folded. Her breath stayed even, but something inside her chest unlocked. She had prepared herself to be dismissed again. She hadn't prepared for this. The general turned toward her. "Cooper, you are reinstated as a sniper candidate. You'll work with our leadership to help redesign the training curriculum. We need your insight and your clarity." Rachel blinked once, then nodded slowly. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like something deeper. Being seen. She rose to her feet, notebook in hand. Captain Davis gave her a small nod. It wasn't warm, but it was real. A quiet acknowledgement that the one he had overlooked had changed the course of the program he once controlled. Outside the conference room, the hallway felt wider somehow. The cold walls didn't press so hard. She stepped into the light with a purpose that no one could take from her again. The woman with the old rifle and the quiet voice had redrawn the map. Back in the armory, she placed the notebook on the table and opened it to a clean page. New curriculum notes, observation drills, stress-based decision training. Her handwriting came slow but sure, each line more certain than the last. She didn't need to say much to anyone. Word would spread faster than she ever could. And for the first time since stepping foot on that mountain, Rachel Cooper walked through the base not as a mistake, but as the reason it had found its way back to the truth. The flag still snapped in the same cold wind, but everything else at Fort Bright Rock had changed. 6 months after Rachel shot, halted a demonstration, and rewrote a doctrine, the mountain base had found a new rhythm. Where once instructors barked about time, now they spoke about thought, observation, and restraint. Recruits moved slower, but not with hesitation. Their steps were measured, their rifles steadier, their eyes sharper. The range drills had been redesigned. No more countdowns for the sake of speed. Now, each test asked a question. Could you wait? Could you think? Could you take the right shot? Not just the fast one. Rachel walked along the firing line with a calm authority. The recruits called her Instructor Martinez now, but she still wore the same boots and carried the same rifle. Her notebook rested in her jacket pocket, thick with years of numbers, angles, and wind charts. She rarely opened it during class, not because she didn't need it, but because most of what mattered had already been passed on. On the far end of the range, a familiar figure stepped up to the mark. Tyler stood taller than before, but the bravado was gone. In its place was focus. His gear was simpler now. No flashy add-ons, no polished grips. Just a notebook in his hand, worn at the corners, filled with penciled-in data and careful notes. Rachel approached him as he adjusted his scope. He looked over and gave a small nod. He didn't speak much anymore, but when he did, it carried weight. He had returned not to prove anything, but to learn. And in that, Rachel saw more growth than any perfect shot could measure. Across the range, on the same wall where a slogan once shouted about speed, a new motto had been painted in bold, clean letters. Right shot, right time, every time. It had been her words spoken once to herself, now carried by an entire program. The instructors had changed too. Some had retired, some had stayed and adapted. Those who remained taught differently now. They didn't just lecture. They listened. They asked questions. They trusted silence. Rachel stood behind a new class that afternoon, watching them prepare for a test under shifting wind and irregular targets. She didn't correct them. She didn't hover. She waited the way her grandfather once did, watching for signs of patience, watching for someone who would take the time to get it right. She had never asked for recognition, but as she looked across the range, hearing the deliberate sounds of steady breathing and soft chambering, she felt it anyway, not in applause, but in alignment, in the shape of a program that had found its purpose again. What she built wasn't loud. It didn't flash or shout. It endured, and every recruit who stood on that line carried a part of it forward, quietly, with purpose, just like she had. The morning she packed her duffel, the wind at Fort Bright Rock felt the same. Crisp, steady, curling around the peaks like it always had. But the place itself felt different. Softer somehow. More human. Rachel walked the length of the firing range in silence, boots pressing into ground. She knew by feel. She paused at the 600-yard mark where the ground still held the faint scar from a long-ago shot. Her fingers brushed the edge of a metal target now repainted, but still slightly warped at the edge. That shot had changed everything. Not because it was perfect, but because it was necessary. Back near the armory, her name had already been taken off the duty board. A new instructor would step into her place soon. Someone younger, maybe. Someone trained in a system that had been reborn because she hadn't stayed silent. She smiled, faint and sure. A voice called her name from the steps. It was one of the newer recruits. Barely 20. nervous shoulders still too tense when he walked. He handed her a folded note, eyes wide with something close to reverence. She opened it slowly. "Thank you for changing this place. I shot with the old system once, missed under pressure. Someone almost paid for it. But not anymore. You made it better. You made us better." She folded the note and tucked it into the front page of her notebook, where the first entry had once said wind speed 4 mph, early, drift west. That afternoon, with her bags already in the truck, she sat at her old desk one last time. The armory lights flickered a bit, like always. She opened her notebook and turned to a blank page at the back. The pencil in her hand felt like it always had. Familiar. Grounded. She wrote slowly. Final observation. Patience is a skill. Stillness is not weakness. The right shot takes more than time. It takes trust. In the process. In the quiet. In the long way around. She closed the book and ran her hand along the cover. It wasn't full yet. But it didn't need to be. Legacy doesn't live in ink. It lives in the way others begin to carry the truth you left behind. As the truck pulled away from the gates, Rachel didn't look back. She didn't need to. The wind would carry her story now. Not loudly, but clearly, just like she always had.